Hello, guys, and welcome back to another lovely episode of Combat Talk. I am your favorite MMA host, Sophia Foyer, and I have to say, truly, this is like an honor to even say that I'm speaking to this woman. She is a pioneer in women's MMA, and if you watch the show, I'm all about hyping up the women's MMA, and especially from coming from a background that trains and competes in jiu-jitsu for myself. But we have the honor of speaking with Julie Kedzie, who 16-13, a record MMA. She has fought the who's who in women's MMA. She fought in Strikeforce. She fought in the UFC. She currently is running a program through a school in a jiu-jitsu gym. She currently also commentates for Invicta, so you guys can catch her on there. She's been there since the beginning. So if you want to catch her on Instagram, you can find her at Julie Kedzie. But I do personally recommend watching her fights. Her fights have done so much wonders for us women in MMA. So welcome on the show, Julie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And thank you for that really sweet intro.
Of course. I got to give credit where credit is due. You really have been truly done so much wonders for us girls in this sport. But to get to what we're down to business today, to talk about some of the things that we should be talking about in this sport. How did you actually get into MMA, Julie?
Well, I studied, I've been a practitioner of Taekwondo since I was about 4 years old. My dad put me and my older sister in quite young. And we kept training until, training was sort of a part of what we'd always done. And we moved to Indiana in, I don't even remember the year. I'm so sorry. Oh, man, I'm getting old. But we moved to Indiana when my mother was pursuing graduate school. My mother has a PhD in neurobiology. And in Indiana, we encountered this amazing martial arts school called Monroe County Martial Arts. And it was a school where cross-training was heavily, heavily encouraged. And so my sister and I started training there. And for a lot of people, your gym becomes your whole kind of social life. And especially as teenagers, it was a really good part of my life. And so I kind of discovered Muay Thai kickboxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and combat submission wrestling at that gym. And by the time it was time to test for my third degree black belt in Taekwondo, I was kind of much more interested in them than I was at Taekwondo, and particularly in fighting. I just kind of had this desire to do it. I had watched the UFC before, and it was the early UFCs. We're talking about like 1995 or so, and wasn't actually all that into MMA from that perspective. But in watching them, somebody put on a DVD called Hook and Shoot. And on that Hook and Shoot DVD, it was all female fights. And so shout out to Jeff Osborne, who really did spearhead, women's MMA in the United States. It had been big other places like Japan, and it had its own following. But in the United States, Hook and Shoot was kind of a place where women were featured. And I watched that and absolutely, I was spellbound. I saw women who looked like me and, big shoulders, kind of maybe a little bit rougher around the edges, and women who, just wanted to scrap. And I was very, very fortunate that I also lived in Indiana at that time, and that's where Hook and Shoot took place, Evansville, Indiana. So I went out to California to learn MMA and, spent a couple months out there training with some really amazing people, and came back, was like, no, this is what I want to do. I almost didn't finish college. I had one semester left, and I really just wanted to fight. And my mother was like, please, so many student loans, finish college. So I did, and I luckily got placed with my very first MMA fight with Hook and Shoot shortly thereafter. So it was pretty incredible, like kind of a wonderful convergence of, coincidence and training and just, knowing the right people. And so I had my first fight in that organization, and I absolutely loved it and was hooked ever since.
Oh my God. Like, that made me so excited.
I think that was in 2004 that I had my first MMA fight. Yeah, I think it was 2004. So it's been over 20 years. It's kind of been a while.
For me personally, like, not just as a fan, like, I've watched you since Strikeforce, and talking about Strikeforce, what was it like getting the call saying, okay, I'm going to fight in front of, like, a whole arena of people? Like, what was that feeling like, and what was that call? Like, you're being like, oh, my gosh, like, I got the call to go fight pro.
Well, to be honest, there was no real amateur background for me in MMA, so I started as a pro in 2004. But I didn't really obviously my record shows it. I didn't necessarily care that much about what my record stated. Back then it was the Wild West, and you just took the fights you could take at whatever weight class you could make, and you fought everybody. And I was very, very fortunate to be in a really good, I guess, genre of fighters who were just absolutely tough and always wanted to fight. Now, it was very hard to find opportunities. And so by the time Strikeforce rolled around, I had already changed gyms. I was living in New Mexico. I had opportunities to kind of, I don't know if it's be a little bit more choosy, but definitely to make smarter decisions than I had earlier on in my career. And I had actually not wanted to fight for Strikeforce at first because I was very close friends with their 135-pound champion, Sarah Kaufman. I would go to Canada and train with her. She would come to Albuquerque and train with me. And so when I got the call up to do that, it was one of those situations where she had, I believe at that time, already lost the title. And so this Strikeforce, I was having a hard time. There were some shady promoters in the business and a lot of organizations that went, under. And so whereas I was able to find fights with other things, I'd kind of gotten screwed over on a big deal organization that was paying me a lot of money. And they, and so when the Strikeforce call came up, I was like, yeah, I guess it's time now. I won't be fighting my friend anytime soon. So I might as well, just get in there and do it. And I, it's very fortunate. My actual first fight for Strikeforce was actually supposed to be against Amanda Nunes. She got injured. And so that fight was kind of pushed back. And I ended up fighting, I believe, Alexis Davis. I think I have the timeline right on that. Yeah. And that was not one of my best performances, but along the way, you do find that, how do I explain it? Being in front of the crowd was very nerve-wracking for me, but I was used to it at that point. I think the scariest part was the walk to the cage. Like, I was like, don't look at me. Nobody look at me. I don't want you to look at me. But once the fight starts, you perform how you're trained, or you perform how you rise to the occasion on that night. And so I have quite a few losses on my record, but looking back, I needed every single one of them, I think. Every single one of those losses was a really good lesson to me that carried outside of the cage. That looking back now, I've been retired since 2013. And so looking outside of it, I'm really grateful for them. It was unfortunate. I could have made more money. I could have done this. I could have done that. But at the same time, in reflection, it made me understand the stakes of what I was trying to do as a fighter and also just my growth as a human being. Not to say it hasn't taken a physical toll, because it sure has. But, it was kind of incredible. I was always really grateful for the fans and for, the people who came out there to support me, especially because there weren't a lot of people in the beginning who supported women fighters. And so to come from, I don't know, like when I won the hook and shoot title in 2005, and I don't think there were very many people left in the audience after that, maybe 30 people left, to fighting in front of thousands of people, it was really an incredible journey. But at the end of the day, it was wanting to beat the person in front of me that was first and foremost on my mind. And so the distraction of the crowd, that played into a lot of things, I had to deal with as a person as well.
Oh, it's like a lot of crazy information right now. Just hearing about this makes me feel so more intrigued. But leading off of that, you fought the who's who of women's MMA, and especially a lot of people know who you are and know who these women are. And you had battles, like true wars with these women. What was it like prepping for these fights? And then you get into the cage and you're like, oh, this is actually more of a war than I expected. Like, what was going through your mind through, especially the Miesha Tate fight and the Gina Carano's and the fights in the UFC? You got to display who truly you are as a fighter and as a person because you were able to persevere. But also, what was it like being in those moments, being like, okay, like, I'm going to get through this, and, no matter what happens, this is what I came to do?
Well, the crazy thing, and it's interesting that you point out those two fights, because those, of course, were very high-profile fights against very good and very famous fighters. But the interesting thing is you don't walk into that fight thinking of that person, unless you're doing things right. You don't walk into the fight thinking of that person as somebody famous or somebody, you have to beat. Because I think at that point, you have to beat everybody in front of you, right? You go into every fight believing you're going to win, convinced you're going to win. And those two fights were no exception. I truly believed I was going to, beat them in those fights. And that probably is why the performances were so good despite being lost. At the end of the day, it's you and the other person in the cage. And all the training that leads up to it, it could be really good training, and you want it to be good training. It could be training that maybe, falls short of what it needed to be for that fight, whether it was where you were, as a fighter, or maybe you had injuries or whatever it is. There's times when you don't necessarily perform 100%. But with the mindset that I'm here to win, I don't care who the opponent is, you generally just go into a sort of flow state. So it was the times in my fights when I stopped to think is when I got in trouble. It was the times in my fights, and those two fights, despite being losses, were times when I went into that flow state. I fought because I was fighting, and that was it. That was the be all end all. The person in front of me was trying to do what I needed to do, which has got me, which brought out the best in me, I guess. And I think that as, on a bigger level, when we think about overcoming difficult things in our lives, whether it's, finishing a term paper or, helping somebody across the street, something like that, we're not necessarily letting our minds dwell on all of the things happening all around us, but we're in that moment. We're living in that moment. And it's a crazy way to be because it's not necessarily super accessible all the time. And in fighting, it wasn't always accessible to me. Some of my worst performances were because I was thinking in there. Something happened where I was distracted. Something in my mind took off and I wasn't present. I wasn't in that fight. And I don't know. I know that in Buddhism, being present is a huge, huge deal. Like that's, there's a huge emphasis on that. And I believe that's absolutely true. I don't know that the human mind is able to do that all the time. I'm somebody who actually had a late in life diagnosis of ADHD, and it actually made so much sense to me when they described all of the things that I just kind of dismissed as, I'm just weird. I go into hyper focus mode, or I can't focus at all. All these things that I thought that was just all made up and I'm just a weirdo and I'm undisciplined were actually things that were huge strengths in a fight. And so, it's about kind of that hyper focus. I think many, many fighters have, I guess I would say elements of ADHD or something to that effect. I can't, this is just a theory. Of course, there's nothing I have that can really back that up. But I believe that ability to hyper focus or to suddenly be in a moment, but with all your concentration on one thing is kind of an incredible gift. And I'm really lucky I have it. I don't know that it served me outside of the cage as well as it could have been. But, I'm really lucky that I was able to access that side of myself or find peace with that side of myself through fighting and in fights. And so those are the fights where maybe my hand was not raised, but my heart was maybe raised a little bit more. My senses were maybe a little bit more elevated, a little bit more in tune with who I am as a person. And, you kind of, as crazy as it sounds, and all of that chaos, in those moments, you do find a sense of peace that it's very hard to find outside of the cage. And I have to say, I've been retired again for over a decade, a long time. And I don't find that sense of peace a lot that I did in the cage or in massively awesome training sessions. I find it sometimes. I find it with writing, but it's hard to access. It's much harder to access with writing. So, long answer to that. Sorry.
We love it. I truly do love it. But with you talking about ADHD, not to say it in a negative way, the mentality part of fighting, as everybody knows, is a huge, huge part in this sport. For you personally, throughout your career, where do you feel like your mental took the most priority? Oh,
like my mental approach?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think that's a really complex thing to answer because, there's a million things, like you see all these signs on the training walls, right, of gyms and stuff, like, fighting is 90% this, and this is, it's this and this. And it's like, I don't know if I can quantify that specifically. I know that when I have something, and I hesitate to use the word obsession because I use it too much, maybe, or maybe not in the right context. But when I have something that I care about fully, I can be blind to everything else around me. Or I can, I guess, maybe lessen the impact everything else around me has. And I think that is a mental gift. But when it comes to like being mentally strong, I don't know. I know that I was tough. I don't think I have the same level of toughness that I used to have. And I think that's kind of a good thing, because toughness and having kind of this bullheaded mentality together can get you very, very far until it doesn't. I believe I was extremely hard on myself. Like, I held myself up to an extremely large standard or high standard in terms of, I have to win. What am I doing wrong? I have to fix everything I'm doing wrong. This kind of perfectionism mentality. And the truth is, we're never going to attain perfectionism. Now, that mentality really served me early on because I didn't have access to maybe mental coaches or things that could put that into perspective. But it also really, I think, hurt me at the end of my career because it was hard for me to adjust out of that and to focus on, I don't want to say, I'm not a huge fan of everything being positive all the time. It's not a method that works for me necessarily in life. I think I have kind of not a negative mindset, but I have a mindset where I look to see what can go wrong. And I don't want to shame myself or any other people who have that mindset, because I think positivity itself can be sort of toxic. I mean, obviously I want to be a positive person. I want to see the world in a good light, but we also have to see what can go wrong so we can prevent that. And so still to this day, I'm finding the balance with that kind of conditioning of my brain to be like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? I have to get it right. I have to get it right. I got to go, do it a million times, because that led to a lot of injuries. It led to a lot of poor decisions, but it did play into my toughness, and it led me to not quitting a lot of the time. And so the older I am, the more I'm realizing, like, hey, I'm really grateful that I had that, but I'm not necessarily that person anymore. And I need to, in order to look outside of myself and my singular focus on winning every fight, I need to look outside of that and see, well, what did I gain from this experience now? So I know I'm not exactly answering your question, but I think the mental game is huge. I think what becomes super important for fighters or for any athlete is to train that mental game in a way that's going to benefit you. To find how your mind works, and don't necessarily change yourself, but to find the ways to reframe your thinking so that it leads to what you need. I hope that answered. Yeah, I hope that answered your question somewhat.
That was perfect. Yeah. I can't even lie. That was perfect. Now my next question is kind of a two-part. So the first part is, you talk about the tough. When you started, there wasn't really a lot of women. In your honest opinion, everybody and all the journalists have an opinion of women fighters and saying, oh, we can't do. No, I don't believe in that. But as yourself, and you fought at the highest of highs, what, in your own opinion, without anybody else in the room, and what made you feel like you were different from everybody in the room in MMA?
Gosh, from everybody in the room in terms of thinking women could do it?
Yes.
Or thinking I could fight when nobody else thought I could? I think I have something that, well, I think most fighters have this actually, and it might be some sort of genetic trait, or it might be some sort of, learned mentality, but it's just like, if I'm told I can't do something, I want to do it even more. I think there's some people who have this pushback against it, or like, no, F you, I'm doing what I want to do. Now that obviously, has become some kind of constraint on that on a social level, right? I don't want to go around and cause harm with what I do, or with that kind of attitude. But if I'm told I can't do something, I immediately want to do it. I find a way to do it and get it done. And I've been very stubborn like that my whole life. It might be a birth order thing. I don't know. It might be because I come from some pretty high achieving women in my family. But I think it was just that, no, it actually might be because I was raised to believe I could do anything I wanted to do if I put in the work. And so, I think there's kind of a combination of things. But when there were the naysayers, the people saying women can't do it, women can't fight, women shouldn't do it, and stuff like that. And it's like, I feel like so much of that is a narrative we let other people control. I didn't have too many run-ins with the journalists in the sport. I think a lot of them, I think that a lot of them rehashed the claims that there's not enough women for a division in the UFC. There's not enough women for this, this sort of thing. It's just like, well, those things are narratives controlled by somebody else because they want to make money, right? Those things are narratives that are not necessarily taking into account the individual journey. I say individual journey, but I mean of the collective of women in the sport collectively, which sounds, I guess, a little, it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but it makes sense that like there's a journey that women are all taking together or took together in this sport for recognition and for, to prove that they had what it takes. And it's still uphill. I mean, it's, we still have people to this day saying, oh, when the women's fights are on, we're going to go, that's when I take a break. And it's like, it's kind of ridiculous because there are so many finishes in women's fights. There's so many really exciting and wonderful female fights. I mean, that's why I'm very lucky to work for Invicta because it's all women and I get to experience that. And so having that as an actual fact, like, no, you're just wrong. I see evidence that this is exciting, that it's important, that these women are fantastic athletes. I see evidence of this all the time. Then it's just like, well, I have the facts on my side. You have the opinions. And, and those opinions are actually somebody else's opinions. If you watched it without hearing all these other people saying this on the forums or whatever it is, like, or, Dana White one day liking it and then the next day hating it. And you know what I mean? It's like, those are all things that like, okay, you're wrong, but I don't even, at this point, I don't have to waste my time telling people that they're wrong. Early on, I got into a lot of fights about it. I was really, I'm going to prove everybody right. It's like, you can't. If people are just unwilling to accept the fact that something is good and something is real, I mean, it's worth fighting for a second to try to change their mind. But ultimately, they've already put on their glasses or their lenses that are saying that they're always going to see it in a different way, that they're going to then, like they have to have their own opinion changed. They have to understand truth. Like, and I mean, I should say fact, not truth. They have to understand it by being exposed to it and seeing it. Some people really want to hold on to their opinions about things. They want to hold on to this mentality. And I don't know why, except maybe it's comforting to think that women suck as fighters, or it's, because it's how it used to be. And God forbid our minds change about anything. But, once you open yourself up to having your mind changed, and once you actually review and see these fights, they're pretty incredible. I don't think that the female fights in the UFC, for example, are any worse than some of the male fights we've seen. I think the whole product, the whole UFC model and product as a whole has gotten insanely diluted. But it's not because of the women. It's because of the structuring and the way it's working now. And it's because they turned it into this kind of puppy mill of money making. And, it's like, it's unfortunate. It doesn't do credit to the fighters. And male and female fighters suffer from this mentality. So that's my lecture on it.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, from my personal experience, I had to deal with doubts, and I had not even just men, but I had people in general saying like, oh, the women are boring. But it's like, you're not the one stepping on the mat. You're not the one going in the cage. You don't know what it's like to have that adrenaline. You have to go through experience. You're the one stuck in that spot. But to ease into what you do now is commentating Invicta. After your fight career, what was some of the things that you were most proud of that you could say, yeah, I accomplished that. Yeah, that was in my career. Like, what was some of the things for you as a fighter before the commentating you said, you know what, I can take proud and I can say, yeah, I accomplished that in my career? I mean,
honestly, I would say every single fight. To a certain extent. And also, I take pride in the fact that in my career, I tried to help other women. I didn't do it enough. Let me preface that by saying I did not do that enough. I should have. But when you're a fighter, you are thinking about your fight, who you get to fight, who you want to beat. Everybody is kind of your enemy. Or not enemy, that's a little extreme. But, everybody's your adversary to a certain extent. But, looking back, I really hope, and I don't think I consciously did this, but I really hope I didn't underplay other people's accomplishments, other women's accomplishments in this sport. And I feel like that is something that I really, really strive to do, is uplift other women. And that sounds banal. It sounds like a cliche, right? But at the same time, it is my proudest thing in the sport that I've done that I'm, as a commentator as well, trying to show the good things that are happening on in the cage. I mean, I'm critical as hell, but I also I understand martial arts is a really, really big deal. And we're part of this kind of insane cultural thing that's happening where we're showing our most the most kind of violent side of human nature in a way that is contained and a way that's beautiful. And, if you can make something like the way we want to hurt each other beautiful and have people shake hands at the end of it. I know there's trash talk and there's the marketing and some people just don't like each other. But, ultimately you are in the cage with somebody who is putting in the work as you can't be in the cage unless you have an adversary. You don't fight yourself. I mean, you do fight yourself eventually, but that's a whole other thing. But it's something that you are maybe doing against somebody, but you are doing it together. And so to that, I'm absolutely grateful for every single woman who stepped in there with me. Regardless of the outcome or regardless if we ever stayed friends or became friends, we did it together. And I'm really proud that I can see that clearly. And that I hope that I saw it clearly then. I hope I gave my opponents enough credit. The rest of the world's going to try to tear you down. Tear each other down physically, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to accomplish something beautiful against one another. But yeah, it might not be exciting for promoters that I didn't like the trash talk, and that's fine. I still don't like, I enjoy trash talk. I think it's fun. I think it's fun when people do that, but I still feel very grateful to my opponents and to every woman that steps in the cage. And I also feel that's my proudest thing, I think, is that I know and I understand that gratitude. A little bit sentimental of an answer, but it's the God's honest truth. Like I feel very, very lucky. Fighting did not do me any favors as a human being in terms of finances, in terms of the stuff I have to deal with now in my life. It didn't, but it meant the world to me as a human being in terms of how I personally see the world and what I get from my interactions with other people.
Wow. I love all of that. I can't thank you enough for what you've done in this sport. But, and you commentating in Invicta, you obviously get to see a lot of fights, commentating right in front of your face. And especially with the women fighters, we've seen the fighters like Michelle Waterson, we've seen Rose Namajunas, we've seen many countless stars come out of Invicta. What was it like to first start commentating in Invicta and see a lot of people go from Invicta to the UFC?
Well, it was actually terrifying because I was still an active fighter my first couple of Invictas. In fact, I was fighting in Australia, the first Invicta I ever missed. I was fighting, and so it was crazy to be missing an entire card and not be there for that because I absolutely loved doing it. To watch where they are now is, I didn't have any doubt that they would make it there. It was just a matter of, waiting for the powers that be out there politically to recognize how great they were. Somebody like Rose Namajunas, incredible athlete, incredible fighter, really interesting human being. So, and, Michelle Waterson, of course, she was a former training partner. It was, seeing her go to the UFC was like seeing a family member, accomplish their dreams. It was incredible. But to be honest, when I was first there commentating, I was terrified because I'm like, I could be fighting half these people. I am not in the cage right now. And I think most fighters who have also coached will tell you coaching is so hard or cornering somebody is so hard if you like them, and because, if they're your teammate or whatever, you're scared. You can't do the thing for them that they need to do. And you might say something from the outside that they either can't execute at the time or they don't hear you or it's just not clicking for them and you are powerless to do anything except yell the same thing over and over. And as a commentator, I know I've been accused of bias. It was something I worked really hard to fight against. But now at this point, I'm just like, everybody accuses everybody of bias. There is no unbiased perspective in this sport. So we might as well just try to do the best in the moment that we have to say what we honestly feel and think. And that's, that's kind of the stance I take on that. But, kind of to go back to them accomplishing these things, I'm proud. I would say I felt really proud. When I retired and I did commentary full time and matchmaking for a while, that was a difficult time for me too, because I was going through my own identity struggles and I was going through, just huge life events happened, for me during that time. And so I may have not been the best commentator or matchmaker at that period, but I really, that was also a time when all of these divisions were getting pulled into the UFC. And it was just like, it was so exciting. It was amazing. And even though course, I'm very Invicta biased. I want everybody to fight for Invicta. I want everybody to stay with Invicta. Like, these are my people. I want all of us here. But, you know, when you see women who you've seen their first fight and you see them step up into the UFC, of course, it's an incredible feeling to think they accomplished the journey that I accomplished. They're doing better than me in the journey. And, you know, it's just like, it's cool as hell.
When you talk about that, especially fully going into commentating after you stopped fighting, what was like the hardest challenge for you as a commentator? Because obviously as a fighter, you know, you can know a lot more than the commentators, because sometimes the commentators don't do the sport. But also, what was it like to be on that side? Like, what was some of the things that you learned as a commentator that you thought would have maybe helped in fighting or were more interesting on the other side?
Well, I would say when you're doing the commentary, you are not thinking about the people who know everything in the world about MMA. You're thinking about the people who maybe have tuned in for the first time or don't understand what's going on. And it was extremely hurtful to see other fighters make fun of me, maybe reducing phrases and things down to like the common bone of it. But I'm also a communicator. I'm also like, I have a writing degree. I understand that there's so many people outside of this world who do not understand the insider things that we do in MMA. It is a niche sport, yes, but there are a lot of people who are just tuning in and they're like, why the hell is her hand that way? Or what is happening here? Or why is she dancing away like that? And you don't always want to use all the super technical language. You have to, you know, and so finding a balance with, I need to explain to somebody why this is going on a maybe more reductive level, but I also need to explain, you know, but then, you know, and then you see other people making fun of you for saying it in a way they're like, well, duh, of course they're doing that. It's just like, what you end up learning is that it doesn't really matter who you're pleasing. And I have a distinct approach and distinct voice, and it's gotten a lot of critique. And I get it. I am not, well, John Anik is a play-by-play guy, so it's a bad comparison. But, you know, I'm not him. I'm not somebody like that. I'm not trained in this. I'm not a trained broadcaster by any means. I'm a trained communicator. And I know that sounds different, but it really is different, like putting the show on and understanding what the show is as opposed to being yourself. And what I've learned is like, I'm still here. I'm still with the organization. I love this organization. I'm staying myself. I'm not going to try to be corporate or commercial or say things the way other people say them. And, you know, I think a lot of that came from trying to fix that early on and trying to be like everybody else and trying to please everyone in my commentary early on. And finally just settling into, no, this is where I am. This is who I am. This is how I'm going to be talking about these fights. And, you know, Shannon Knapp will tell me if there's a problem. She'll tell me if how I'm delivering is not working for everything. But she has not told me that. She likes how I commentate, I think. And she, you know, and she's kept me around this long. So what I think what I've learned about it is like, in all things, we can't do the things that we're doing based on the approval of other people. Now, I say that, as I said, Shannon likes what I'm doing, but she's my employer, so it's a little bit different, you know. but I'm saying, you know, there's no way to please everybody with what you're saying and what you're doing. At the end of the day, it's my job to give credit to the people who are fighting, to the women in the cage, and to try to explain what they're doing in such a way so people can see it clearly, so they can hopefully see it beautifully as what they're doing as art. It's also tough. It's also combat. It's also really ugly sometimes. And I think you have to find a way, or I had to find a way to compartmentalize, you know, the outside noise and what's happening in there. And hopefully I'm doing it well. If I'm not, or if people don't think I am, that's okay. They're allowed to say that. They're allowed to have their opinions. It really can't shake the core of what I'm trying to accomplish. So in a fight, you're trying to win. In commentating, you are trying to open that world up for somebody who's watching it. And so it's two different things, definitely, you know, two different examples of something, but it's, you know, at the end of the day, I really want to, I don't know, I want to pay tribute to them, but I also want to hold them maybe accountable for the mistakes that are being made, or not necessarily hold them accountable, I shouldn't say that, but point out to people when there's a flaw. But I have to say that, you know, I don't really do fight predictions. you can kind of tell on paper when somebody like, oh, they've had way more fights or they've fought this person, or they've had this. But my favorite thing as a commentator is to introduce somebody, talk about all their accomplishments and, just be really excited about them and then completely be proven wrong by somebody. It is the best part of MMA that each fighter holds the potential to completely blow away your expectations or to completely surprise you, to upend anything that you thought was going to happen. And it's also what I love the most about it. You see the fighters who you never really on paper could see winning this. I cheer for all of them. It's hard to see anybody lose, really. But, it's just like, to see just have somebody blow away your expectations. That's incredible. It's very, very inspiring. Again, I'm very long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, that was perfect. I love that answer. The last question that I have for you before we wrap up is, you've been with Invicta since the very beginning, as we have learned through the interview. From being Invicta, what are some of the different things that Invicta does and that you like that Invicta does compared to when you were fighting?
Invicta puts the athletes first, always. Shannon Knapp makes it about the athletes. She's very, very firm on that. And I will say, in my experience with other organizations, they want the pretty girl who fights, or they want to paint this as, oh, it's beauty versus the beast, or it's this or it's that, or she's going to sell tickets because she looks this way, or this and that. Shannon Knapp wants the best athletes fighting the best athletes. And she doesn't like squash matches. She doesn't like one person clearly outclassing another person. She wants them to go in there and work and be their best. And that actually surprisingly gets a lot of criticism in MMA. It's just like people like to see these giant, the culture spawned off slap fighting, which I think is crap. And you can put that on tape. I think it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen, because they want to have the highlight without the actual build up to that highlight. In MMA, you're going to have boring fights. And a lot of those boring fights are not because the athletes suck, but it's because they're both working for inches on the inside. They're both working to overcome tiny, tiny things that we can't possibly understand outside of it. And that's how they grow. That's how fights are won. That's how they fail as well. And what Invicta does best, I think, is that the athletes are the most important part of the organization. Not the money, not the Invicta name, but the athletes. Every single one of them fighting for us gets treated with respect and with honor as somebody who's going out there to do a job. And I know it sounds like I sound hyperbolic, but it's the absolute truth. The athletes come first always.
I love to hear that, because we see that, a lot of organizations tend to screw people over. And you could probably talk about this more than I could from your experience. But I've been watching Invicta since I was like a little kid, and it was always something that I loved watching and seeing fighters rise and go to the top. But I thank you for coming on the show, and I hope to work with you in the future and hopefully get a working relationship out of this. But I thank you so much for what you've done for women's MMA, and what you currently do now is history making. So that was the one, the only Julie Kedzie, and you guys can follow her on Instagram at Julie Kedzie. And hopefully you tune in to Invicta, because you're going to be hearing the one, the only.
Cool, thank you.
And you need to tune into Invicta. So I will see you guys next time on Commentator.